The metallic click of musket locks echoed through the pre-dawn darkness as Captain John Parker adjusted his grip on his Brown Bess musket. Around him on Lexington Green, 7 to 7 colonial militiamen stood in loose formation, their breath visible in the crisp April air of 1775. None of them knew that within hours, they would fire the shots that would echo round the world and ignite a revolution that would change the course of human history. The tension had been building for months. Since the Boston Tea Party in 1773, King George III's government had tightened its grip on the Massachusetts colony with what colonists called the Intolerable Acts. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, found himself sitting atop a powder keg of colonial resentment. The Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and John Hancock, had been organizing resistance throughout New England, and intelligence reports suggested they were stockpiling weapons and ammunition in the village of Concord, some 20 miles northwest of Boston. As reported in later accounts by the Massachusetts Historical Society, Gage received direct orders from London to arrest the rebel leaders and seize their military supplies before the situation spiraled further out of control. The plan seemed straightforward. A swift night march to Concord would catch the rebels off guard, allowing British forces to complete their mission and return to Boston before significant resistance could be organized. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the 10th Regiment of Foot received his orders on the evening of April 18th. He was to lead a force of 700 British regulars on what was officially described as a routine patrol. The secrecy surrounding the mission fooled no one. Dr. Joseph Warren, a prominent member of the Committee of Safety, had placed informants throughout British headquarters within hours of Smith receiving his orders. Warren dispatched to riders into the Massachusetts countryside Paul Revere and William Dawes. The British soldiers, many of them veterans of campaigns in Europe and the Caribbean, prepared their equipment with professional efficiency. Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines would serve as Smith's second-in-command, leading the advance guard. These men had trained for conventional warfare against European armies, not the irregular tactics they would soon face from colonial farmers turned soldiers. Meanwhile, in homes throughout Middlesex County, church bells and signal fires carried Warren's warning. Minutemen grabbed their muskets from mantelpieces and rushed to predetermined assembly points. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants who had drilled together on village greens. They understood that their cause was just, but few comprehended the magnitude of what they were about to unleash. As the British column began its march from Boston Common at 10 o'clock that night, moving silently through the moonlit countryside, Captain Parker dismissed most of his men with orders to reassemble at the sound of the alarm bell. He kept only a few sentries posted, not expecting the British to arrive before dawn. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform 13 separate colonies into a unified nation fighting for independence. Paul Revere's horse thundered across the wooden planks of Charlestown Bridge as he began his legendary ride through the Massachusetts countryside. The silversmith had volunteered for this dangerous mission, knowing that capture meant certain death. As a traitor to the crown, behind him, the lights of Boston flickered like distant stars, while ahead lay 20 miles of treacherous roads and potential British patrols. Revere's first stop was the home of Reverend Jonas Clark in Lexington, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock had taken refuge. As political leaders of the colonial resistance, both men were marked for arrest by General Gage. Revere pounded on Clark's door shortly after midnight, shouting warnings about the approaching British column. Adams, ever the revolutionary, reportedly declared with satisfaction that the British move would surely bring war. William Dawes had taken a different route, traveling through Boston Neck and the southern roads toward Lexington. The tanner's apprentice lacked Revere's connections, but possessed an intimate knowledge of backwoods trails that allowed him to avoid British checkpoints. His arrival at Clark's house confirmed Revere's intelligence about the British march. Dr. Samuel Prescott, a young physician returning from courting a lady in Lexington, joined the two riders as they continued toward Concord. The three men had traveled barely a mile when British mounted patrols captured Revere and Dawes. Only Prescott, familiar with every stone wall and creek bed in the area, managed to escape and continue spreading the alarm to Concord. According to historical records preserved by the Concord Museum, church bells and signal guns began sounding throughout the region as the alarm spread from town to town. In Acton, Captain Isaac Davis assembled his company of Minutemen. In Lincoln, Captain William Smith's men prepared for battle. The countryside was awakening to the sound of impending conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Smith's British column made slow progress through the darkness. The soldiers, weighted down with full packs and ammunition, struggled through muddy roads still soft from spring rains. Smith had expected to reach Lexington by dawn, but poor road conditions and the need for stealth slowed their advance significantly. Worse still, the sound of alarm bells ringing across the countryside told him that surprise had been lost. Major Pitcairn, leading the advance guard of light infantry, pushed ahead of the main column as they approached Lexington. His orders were clear: secure the village green and prevent any armed resistance from forming. The Marine officer had served in North America for several years and understood colonial tactics better than most of his colleagues. He knew these farmers could fight. When cornered in Lexington, Captain Parker had reassembled his militia company as the alarm bells continued ringing. Most of his men were farmers and craftsmen who had left warm beds and worried families to answer the call. They stood on the village green in the pre-dawn darkness, muskets loaded, but with strict orders not to fire unless fired upon. Parker understood that any aggressive action by his small force would be seen as rebellion against lawful authority. As false dawn began lightening the eastern sky, British drums could be heard approaching through the woods. The sound grew steadily louder, accompanied by the rhythmic tramp of hundreds of marching feet. The 7-7 Colonials on Lexington Green faced a force nearly 10 times their size, but they held their ground with the quiet determination of men defending their homes and families. The moment that would change everything was now only minutes away. The sun had not yet risen when Major John Pitcairn's advance guard of British light infantry emerged from the morning mist on Lexington Green. The sight that greeted them was both surprising and troubling. 7-7 Colonial militiamen stood in ragged formation across the village common, their muskets gleaming in the pale dawn light. Captain John Parker, a veteran of the French and Indian War, held his position at the center of his men, knowing that retreat now would appear cowardly, while resistance seemed suicidal. Pitcairn, a seasoned officer who had served with distinction in various colonial campaigns, understood the delicate nature of the situation. His orders were to secure Lexington and continue to Concord, not to engage in unnecessary combat with colonial militia. However, the sight of armed rebels openly defying British authority presented a direct challenge to royal sovereignty that could not be ignored. The British column deployed in a battle formation with practiced precision. Red-coated soldiers spread across the green in a long line, their bayonets fixed and muskets at the ready. The morning air filled with the sounds of military commands and the metallic rattle of equipment. As professional soldiers prepared for combat, behind them, Lieutenant Colonel Smith's main force continued approaching, their drums beating the steady rhythm of an army on the march. According to witness accounts later compiled by the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, Captain Parker realized his position was hopeless. Facing overwhelming odds, he issued the order that would become legendary: stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. His words reflected the colonists' position perfectly. They would not initiate hostilities, but neither would they simply disperse at British command. Major Pitcairn rode forward, his sword drawn but pointed downward in a gesture meant to appear non-threatening. His voice carried clearly across the green as he shouted, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels, and disperse." The words struck the assembled militia like a physical blow. To be called rebels was to be branded as traitors, subject to hanging. Under British law, some militiamen began moving toward the edges of the green, unwilling to face certain death in an unequal fight. Others held their positions, torn between loyalty to their captain and concern for their families. The tension became almost unbearable as British soldiers advanced closer, their officers shouting commands to maintain formation and discipline. Parker, seeing his men beginning to waver and recognizing the impossibility of his situation, finally gave the order to disperse. But as the militia began to withdraw, keeping their muskets in hand as befitted free Englishmen, a single shot rang out across the green. To this day, historians debate who fired that first shot, British soldier or colonial militiaman, accidental, discharge, or deliberate provocation. What followed was not a battle, but a brief, savage encounter that lasted perhaps 10 minutes. British discipline collapsed as soldiers, thinking themselves under attack, opened fire without orders. Musket balls whined across the green, striking down militiamen who were attempting to withdraw. Parker's cousin Jonas was among the first to fall. blood spreading across the spring grass as his life ebbed away. The sound of gunfire echoed across Lexington like thunder, carrying news of the conflict to every corner of Massachusetts. 8 colonials lay dead on the village green, with 9 more wounded. British casualties numbered only 1 soldier slightly wounded and Major Pitcairn's horse grazed by a musket ball. But in those brief moments of violence, the American Revolution had begun. As smoke cleared from the green and British soldiers reformed their ranks, Lieutenant Colonel Smith arrived with the main column. The die was cast. There could be no retreat from the path now chosen. The march to Concord would continue, but the mission had already transformed from a simple raid into the opening engagement of a war for independence. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith surveyed the aftermath on Lexington Green with growing unease. 8 colonial bodies lay scattered across the grass, while his soldiers attempted to restore order after the unexpected violence. The mission parameters had fundamentally changed in those brief moments of gunfire. What began as a routine confiscation of rebel supplies had become an act of war against British subjects who now had legitimate grievance against the Crown. Smith ordered his column to reform and continue toward Concord, but the delay at Lexington had cost precious time. The sun now climbed higher into an April sky that promised a warm day, and the sound of gunfire had surely alerted every militia company within 20 miles. Intelligence reports suggested that Concord housed the largest cache of rebel military supplies in Massachusetts, making its capture essential to preventing further colonial resistance. Major John Pitcairn, shaken by the morning's events, rode alongside Smith as the British column resumed its march. Both officers understood that their force of 700 men, impressive though it appeared, was now operating deep in hostile territory with limited communication to their Boston headquarters. Every farmhouse they passed might shelter armed colonials, and every hill could conceal an ambush. The 6-mile march from Lexington to Concord took the British through rolling countryside, dotted with stone walls and thick woods that provided excellent cover for colonial skirmishers, as documented in later British military reports held by the National Archives. Smith began receiving intelligence from loyalist sources about massive militia mobilization throughout central Massachusetts. Companies from Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, and Sudbury were converging on Concord to defend the stored military supplies. Meanwhile, in Concord itself, Colonel James Barrett commanded the militia efforts to remove or hide the weapons cache before British arrival. Barrett, a veteran of frontier warfare, had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. Cannons were rolled into nearby swamps, musket balls were distributed among local households, and gunpowder was scattered to farms throughout the surrounding countryside. The approaching British could hear church bells ringing continuously now, their bronze voices carrying urgent warnings across the Massachusetts landscape. What had begun as a secret night march had become a public parade, watched by hundreds of colonial eyes. Smith understood that his return to Boston would be far more dangerous than his advance to Concord. Dr. Samuel Prescott had successfully carried Paul Revere's warning to Concord during the early morning hours. The young physician's midnight ride through familiar countryside allowed him to alert Colonel Barrett well before the British column appeared on Concord's outskirts. This advance warning proved crucial in saving most of the hidden military supplies from British confiscation. As Smith's force approached Concord around 8 o'clock in the morning, they encountered their first organized colonial resistance since Lexington. Captain David Brown's company of Concord militia had deployed on a ridge overlooking the town, their muskets visible in the morning sunlight. However, faced with overwhelming British numbers, Brown conducted a fighting withdrawal toward North Bridge, where Colonel Barrett had positioned his main defensive force. The British entered Concord unopposed, immediately beginning systematic searches for hidden weapons and ammunition. Companies of light infantry spread throughout the town, searching barns, cellars, and outbuildings for contraband military supplies. Their efforts yielded disappointingly small results. Most of the cache had been successfully hidden or removed during the night. Smith established his headquarters at Wright's Tavern in the town center, where he could coordinate search operations while maintaining communication with his scattered companies. From the tavern's windows, he could observe colonial militia companies forming on surrounding hills like gathering storm clouds. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with British forces becoming increasingly isolated in hostile territory unknown to Smith. More than 400 colonial militiamen had already assembled near North Bridge under Colonel Barrett's command. These men represented the largest organized resistance force, yet gathered against British authority in Massachusetts. They were armed, determined, at fighting on familiar ground against an enemy far from its base of supply and support. The stage was set for the confrontation that would transform the morning's violence from an isolated incident into sustained warfare between Britain and her American colonies. Colonel James Barrett positioned his 400 militiamen on Punkatasset Hill, overlooking the wooden span that would forever be known as North Bridge. From this elevated position, the colonial commander could observe British light infantry companies crossing the bridge to search farms on the north side of the Concord River. Barrett understood that controlling this crossing was essential. It represented the only practical route for British forces to continue their mission or retreat safely to Boston. Captain Walter Laurie led 96 British soldiers across North Bridge with orders to search Colonel Barrett's farm for hidden military supplies. The irony was not lost on Barrett, watching enemy soldiers march toward his own property while he commanded the force that could destroy them. However, the aging militia colonel held his fire, hoping to avoid further bloodshed while protecting the weapons cache hidden throughout his land. The morning sun climbed higher as more colonial militia companies arrived on Punkatasset Hill. Captain Isaac Davis brought his acting company, distinguished by their matching equipment and disciplined appearance. Major John Butcher commanded Concord's own militia, men who knew every stone and tree in the surrounding countryside. Together, these companies represented the largest armed colonial force assembled since the French and Indian War, according to accounts preserved in the Concord Free Public Library. Smoke began rising from the center of town as British soldiers destroyed captured military supplies. From their hilltop position, the militia could see flames consuming what appeared to be substantial quantities of colonial property. Angry murmurs rippled through the ranks as young men watched their town burning while they stood idle on the surrounding hills. Captain Davis, whose acting company had marched through the night to reach Concord, approached Barrett with growing urgency. His men had left farms and families to defend colonial rights, and watching British soldiers destroy their property without resistance violated every instinct of free Englishmen. Davis argued forcefully for immediate action before the British could complete their mission and escape. Barrett faced an agonizing decision. Military wisdom counseled patience. His force could harass the British retreat without risking a direct confrontation against professional soldiers. However, political necessity demanded action. Colonial resistance would lose credibility if militia companies assembled, only to watch British forces operate with impunity throughout Massachusetts. Major Buttrick assumed tactical command as Barrett ordered the advance toward North Bridge. The militia moved down Punkatasset Hill in good order, their muskets loaded and bayonets fixed for close combat. Unlike the scattered farmers who had faced British fire at Lexington, these men advanced as organized companies under experienced officers who understood battlefield tactics. Captain Laurie, observing the colonial advance from Barrett's farm, immediately recognized his precarious position. His 96 men were isolated on the north side of the river, facing a force 4 times their size. Military protocol demanded immediate withdrawal across North Bridge to rejoin Lieutenant Colonel Smith's main force in Concord Center. However, retreat under enemy pressure would appear cowardly and might encourage further colonial aggression. The British soldiers at North Bridge formed defensive positions behind stone walls and wooden fences as the militia approached. These were veteran troops who had served in European campaigns, trained to deliver disciplined volleys that could shatter attacking infantry. However, they faced an enemy that fought by different rules: colonial militia who used terrain and individual marksmanship rather than formal battlefield tactics. As the distance between opposing forces closed to less than 100 yards, Captain Laurie made the fatal decision to open fire. British muskets erupted in coordinated volleys, their lead balls whizzing over the heads of approaching militia. The shots were aimed high, perhaps deliberately, but their message was unmistakable. British authority would be maintained through force of arms, if necessary. Major Buttrick's response became legendary. Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire. His command unleashed a devastating return volley from 400 colonial muskets. Unlike the disciplined but ineffective British fire, the militia aimed to kill. Captain Laurie fell wounded, along with several of his soldiers. More importantly, the psychological balance had shifted decisively in favor of the colonials. The British retreat across North Bridge became a rout as militia companies pressed their advantage. Professional soldiers, trained to fight in European formations, found themselves outmaneuvered by farmers who used every stone wall and tree for cover. The bridge that had symbolized British control of Concord now marked the beginning of their long, bloody retreat to Boston. The British withdrawal from Concord began as an orderly military movement, but quickly degenerated into a fighting retreat, unlike anything European trained officers had experienced. Lieutenant Colonel Smith formed his 700 men into a hollow square formation, suitable for protecting against cavalry attacks on open battlefields, but utterly inadequate for the warfare now facing them. Colonial militia companies had positioned themselves behind stone walls, trees, and buildings along every mile of the road back to Boston. Captain Isaac Davis of Acton lay dead at North Bridge, the first colonial officer killed in the American Revolution, but his sacrifice had galvanized resistance throughout central Massachusetts. Word of the morning's fighting spread faster than Smith's retreating column could march, carrying news to militia companies in every surrounding town. Church bells continued their urgent summons as farmers abandoned spring plowing to grab muskets and joined the growing pursuit of British forces. Smith's column faced a tactical nightmare as it moved through the Massachusetts countryside. Colonial marksmen, many of them veterans of frontier warfare, occupied commanding positions along the route while remaining invisible to British soldiers trained for conventional European combat. Every farmhouse potentially sheltered snipers, every stone wall could conceal an ambush, and every hill might hide organized militia companies waiting to strike. The first serious engagement occurred at Miriam's Corner, where the road from Concord crossed a small bridge over a marshy stream. Militia companies from Reading and Billerica had positioned themselves in thick woods on both sides of the crossing, creating a perfect killing ground for the retreating British, as documented in British military dispatches later captured by colonial forces. Smith's men suffered their heaviest casualties of the day during this brief but savage encounter. Major John Pitcairn, whose Marines formed the rear guard of Smith's column, found himself fighting a completely different war than anything in his military experience. Instead of facing formed enemy battalions, his men confronted individual marksmen who appeared, fired, and vanished into familiar terrain. The psychological effect on British soldiers was devastating. They faced an enemy they could rarely see, but who seemed to shoot with deadly accuracy from every direction. The colonial militia, meanwhile, developed their tactics through trial and error during the running battle. Companies that attempted direct assaults against formed British ranks suffered heavy casualties, but small groups of marksmen using guerrilla tactics proved devastatingly effective. The key was mobility. Fire a shot or two, then relocate before British soldiers could organize a counterattack. Dr. Joseph Warren, who had organized the intelligence network that made Paul Revere's ride possible, now rode throughout eastern Massachusetts, coordinating the militia response. Warren understood that this running battle represented a unique opportunity to inflict serious damage on British prestige while demonstrating colonial military capability. His medical training served him well as he moved between wounded militia companies, providing both tactical leadership and emergency medical care. At Bloody Angle in Lincoln, where the road made a sharp turn through dense woods, Massachusetts, militia achieved their most successful ambush of the retreat. Captain William Smith's Lincoln Company, reinforced by men from Sudbury and Wayland, caught Smith's column in a crossfire that killed or wounded dozens of British soldiers. The professional troops, exhausted from their night march and morning's fighting, began showing signs of panic as casualties mounted steadily. Lieutenant Colonel Smith himself fell wounded during the fighting at Bloody Angle, struck in the leg by a militia musket ball that left him barely able to remain mounted. Command devolved to Major Pitcairn, who faced the nightmare scenario of leading a demoralized force through increasingly hostile territory with limited ammunition and no hope of reinforcement. The British soldiers, many of them veterans of European campaigns, found their training inadequate for this new type of warfare. Formal drill movements that served well against French or Spanish armies became death traps when facing colonial marksmen who knew every tree and stone wall in their home countryside. Discipline began breaking down as individual soldiers sought whatever cover they could find, rather than maintaining formation. By early afternoon, Smith's retreat had become a race for survival. The British column, strung out over nearly a mile of road, faced constant harassment from militia companies that seemed to multiply with every passing hour. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Casualties were mounting. and the road to Boston still stretched for many dangerous miles through territory. Now thoroughly roused against British rule, Brigadier General Hugh Percy's relief column of 900 British reinforcements marched out from Boston at 9 o'clock in the morning, their drums beating and colors flying in a display of military pageantry that seemed to mock the desperate situation facing Lieutenant Colonel Smith's battered force. Percy, a capable officer who had served with distinction in European campaigns, understood that his mission was more than a simple rescue operation. It was an attempt to salvage British military prestige in Massachusetts. The sound of continuous musket fire echoing across the countryside told Percy that Smith's expedition had encountered far more resistance than anticipated. Intelligence reports from Loyalist sources described massive militia mobilization throughout eastern Massachusetts, with companies from as far away as New Hampshire and Connecticut marching toward the sound of battle. What had begun as a simple raid was rapidly becoming a major military engagement. Percy's column reached Lexington around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, just as Smith's survivors stumbled onto the village green where the day's violence had begun. The sight that greeted Percy was sobering. British soldiers, their redcoats torn and blood-stained, collapsed from exhaustion, while their officers struggled to maintain even basic military organization. Smith himself was barely conscious, supported in his saddle by concerned subordinates. The merger of Percy's fresh troops with Smith's exhausted survivors created a combined force of nearly 1,600 men, the largest British military concentration in Massachusetts since the French and Indian War. However, Percy quickly realized that numerical superiority meant little in this type of warfare. Colonial militia companies continued arriving from every direction, their numbers growing steadily as news of the fighting spread throughout New England. Percy deployed his artillery to 6-pound cannons that represented the only heavy weapons on either side to sweep Lexington Green clear of militia. The thunderous roar of cannon fire marked an escalation in the day's violence, as British forces employed their most powerful weapons against colonial resistance. However, the psychological effect proved greater than the tactical impact, as militia companies simply melted into surrounding woods and reformed beyond artillery range. As recorded in British military correspondence, later published by the Massachusetts Historical Society, Percy recognized that his position was becoming untenable. Despite reinforcement, his combined force faced an enemy that seemed to grow stronger. With every passing hour, ammunition was running critically low, casualties continued mounting, and the road to Boston remained contested by thousands of aroused colonials. The retreat from Lexington began at 3:30 in the afternoon, with Percy's artillery providing covering fire as his column formed for the march to Charleston. The British general had abandoned any hope of completing the original mission. Survival was now the only objective. His men moved in hollow square formation, with wounded soldiers protected in the center while light infantry companies fought a constant skirmish with pursuing militia. The running battle continued through Menotomy, now Arlington, where some of the day's fiercest fighting occurred. Colonial militia had prepared ambush positions in every building along the main road, forcing British soldiers to clear each structure in costly house-to-house combat. The professional training that served well in European warfare proved inadequate for this intimate, brutal style of fighting in civilian neighborhoods. Dr. Joseph Warren, who had been coordinating militia operations throughout the day, recognized that the British retreat represented a historic opportunity. Never before had colonial forces inflicted such casualties on professional British troops, and the psychological impact of the day's events would resonate throughout the American colonies. Warren's own participation in the fighting demonstrated the commitment of colonial leadership to armed resistance. As Percy's column finally reached the safety of Charleston Peninsula under the protection of British naval guns, both sides began counting the cost of the day's violence. British casualties numbered 73 killed, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, nearly 20% of the expedition force. Colonial losses were significantly lighter, 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing from militia companies throughout eastern Massachusetts. The strategic implications of April 19, 1775 extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. British military supremacy in North America had been challenged successfully by colonial militia, proving that armed resistance was both possible and effective. The shot heard round the world fired at Lexington Green had indeed begun a revolution that would transform 13 separate colonies into a unified nation fighting for independence from the greatest empire in world history. As darkness fell Over Massachusetts, express riders carried news of the day's fighting throughout the American colonies. Within weeks, militia companies from Georgia to New Hampshire would be marching toward Boston, where a British army found itself besieged by the very colonials it had been sent to subdue. The American Revolution had begun with the courage of farmers and craftsmen who chose to stand and fight rather than submit to tyranny. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the end of peaceful resistance and the beginning of armed rebellion that would ultimately create the United States of America.